So I'd like to thank Tom and his colleagues for inviting me to comment today, and thank the authors. I enjoyed the chance to learn about your work. It's nice. It's a pleasure to get an opportunity to read some work by Michael Katz also. I know that, like many of you, my thoughts are with him at this point. The papers are very clear, and there are two, I think, central points that are important and interesting and hold for many towns like this across the country. That both the papers show a very nice picture of how we've had sort of a peak in an earlier wave of immigration in the last century, and then a significant decline in the immigrant populations in towns like this, and now another peak. And the arguments are clear and subtle about how we don't want to make the mistake of assuming that these processes are the same, that the same kinds of things are going on at both times. In some ways they are very similar. They're immigrants coming from different parts of the world, and they're living in some cases in the same housing that the immigrants lived in 100 years ago. But the authors are very clear that while there are many similarities, there are also substantial differences. And it's nice, the central point about how these communities were becoming bedroom communities, as it were, becoming places where people come and live and then go to work, commute out of these suburban towns, these small cities. That as a new demographic pattern is an interesting phenomenon that both papers illustrate very well in a similar region of the country, but in very different kinds of towns. And I've done work here in Pennsylvania, I'll talk about a little bit, and I see a very similar kind of phenomenon, and I know it's going on in many places. So that central illustration of how it is that there are both similarities and important differences in these kinds of communities between earlier and contemporary waves of immigration, and about how it is that there's this new, completely new phenomenon of people living in such places but going out to work, I think is useful, interesting, and has broad generalizability. The second central point that I think is worth underlining is the point about revitalization, that both the papers also give complex accounts of how revitalization is both good and bad, both positive and negative, both rewarding for the people involved in it and also constraining and difficult for the people involved in it. That they give very nice illustrations of how you have increases in population, increases in commerce, many new businesses being started by immigrants, and at the same time, you also have difficult things going on. You have some limited mobility, you have poverty, people being trapped in places, even though it seems like they're living in these suburbs and this shouldn't be happening to them there. So the accounts, you got to hear a little bit, but in these short presentations, you didn't get all of the detail, the nuances of how the papers are able to articulate both sides of this phenomenon. The side where there really is a genuine feeling of hope, optimism, both among long-standing residents of many of these communities and among immigrants themselves about the new businesses that are starting, the new social service agencies, the new opportunities that are being created in places like this. But there is also a genuine sense of pessimism and despair in many ways because people feel themselves limited in various sorts of ways. So I thought that the papers making those 2 points were quite in line with each other, describing different places but very similar patterns, and we're both able to capture nuances of what's happening in ways that was quite powerful. So I enjoyed that in both the pieces of work. What I wanted to do here was to give you a little flavor. I'm an anthropologist, so I have this urge to give you a sense, to sort of evoke for you the feelings of a place like this, and I wanted to do it by showing you this movie, which represents a particular place that I've worked, a place relatively close to here, a town called Norristown. And it's just a 6 or 7 minute movie, and it'll give you a feel for a place where, in this town, most of the immigrants are Mexican, although there are immigrants from various other parts of Latin America and a couple of other regions as well. And so I'd like to give you a feel for what it is in a place like this, how people react to each other. There's B-roll, there's a decent sense of what it's like there, but there's also a sense of what people say about it, how the locals talk about themselves, immigrants talking about themselves, and others talking about them. So let me just show this to you, and then we'll talk about it a little bit.
We're in Norristown, Market Street. We're celebrating the 200th anniversary of Norristown. So a bunch of people got together, a bunch of stores put up. We're selling foods, drinks, funds for kids, propaganda, so we're having a good time. Happy birthday, Norristown.
downslidings, a lot of shops closing, a lot of old businesses that have been here for years closing. Really, you know, the big change has been the infusion of the Latino community, the Mexican community in particular, that has really come in and made Marshall Street a home, and I think has brought the community back, brought the business district back, and the neighborhoods back.
West Marshall Street would be nothing, would still be empty if it wasn't for our immigrants.
The Latino community was one of the reasons why Norristown turned around. Those stores on Marshall Street laid empty for over 15 years.
For the Mexican community, I don't think it's that easy because sometimes they get robbed a lot, they get assaulted because they don't have no way to put money in the bank because they don't have papers. And then they cash, and everybody knows that. Everybody knows that they have cash.
The Hispanic people sometimes are just afraid of going to the police to report anything, you know, just afraid, and it just keeps happening.
They have the right to be here. They're doing things to the area to be here. Now, you're here, they're giving to the community, but we need to get that tax incentive too. We need to be able to get some of that tax money.
Norristonians are very hard at trusting outsiders, people that are not originally from here. They have issues with trusting them to understand what their problems and what their issues are.
But what I hear a lot is that, you know, you have the illegal immigrants, the undocumented. And it really bothers them to see the undocumented using the food stamps and all that, because, you know, once you have a child, you have what they call the anchor baby, so that you're entitled to WIC, Section 8 and all that. And, you know, the anger issue of it is that we're footing the bill for it.
Some of the assumption is that the people come here so they can have access to all the benefits that American citizens have, Social Security or Medicare, Medicaid. It's an outright lie. They have no access to it whatsoever, at all. There's nothing they could do to get funds. Nothing.
People used to be able to leave their door open, screen door, all night long, and nobody would bother them. If anything, they say, yo, that's Bruce Steele's son. Okay? Yeah, that's so-and-so's aunt. Okay? Everybody was so personal. Now, it's turned into a city where nobody knows really who anybody is. And it hurts a little bit. You know, it really hurts a little bit.
Norristonians, born and bred, fighting to bring back to Norristown what we know Norristown to be, small town life, you know, family orientated, home ownership, things like this. I think the Mexicans, as they continue to grow, right now I think they're in a humble way, like this is yours and we're just here, but they're getting tired of that. They're getting restless. They want their voice to be known, they want their presence to be understood. More and more will come, but the ones that will come, I think they'll be more rebellious. And I think they'll want to stand up and establish their own. Hopefully we can create or establish a good enough relationship in this transition to where that doesn't happen. But if we as blacks don't reach out and shake the hands and pull them in as brothers and sisters, then there will be turmoil in the future. I do believe that.
I think that we are the majority now of Mexicans, I mean Hispanic people here in the community, so we don't care a lot anymore about people not liking us because we're more than them. So.
At one time, in my life here, Puerto Ricans and Mexicans got it real bad coming here. Nobody wanted to see them.
the first African Americans on our block on Poplar Street. So I remember my grandparents, making it known that, when we first got here, there really wasn't a huge welcome wagon, following behind us.
It goes back to when the blacks and whites had this town. The whites didn't want any blacks to come in. The blacks didn't want, blah, 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 blah.
This is not Norristown's first experience with immigrant populations. It's really been an immigrant town for as long as its history's been here. When you go back far enough, you look at the Irish immigration, you look at in the 1840s or 50s, the German immigration right after that. Through the 20s, 30s, 40s, there was the Italian immigration. Really into the 50s and 60s was the Italian immigration. Another 10-year hiatus, and then you've got the beginnings, and then the full-fledged Mexican immigration. So this is how Norristown, I think how Norristown has been through its history. We made the decision that we were going to embrace that and make that something that we can use, that the town as a whole can use, that both the immigrants and the long-term residents can use, to make this a good place to live.
So I just wanted to give you an experiential taste of what it's like in a town like this, how it feels. This is Norristown, which is relatively close to here. And I'd like to basically say two things that as we struggle to make sense of places like this, places in Massachusetts, places in New Jersey and Connecticut, places here in Pennsylvania and in other parts of the country, that there are two considerations I'd like to put out there that we should keep in mind. The first one is that we want to try to avoid oversimplifying. We want to take account of the heterogeneous resources, the various sorts of scales that are relevant to making sense of the various processes that go on in a place like this. So in this particular town, it's certainly the case that there's been this new wave of immigrants, in this case mostly from Latin America, who've come over the last couple of decades. And it's certainly true that their patterns of employment share some features with patterns of employment that we see in other similar kinds of towns. But in order to make sense at any given process in a place like this, you also have to take into account some things that are somewhat specific to this particular place. This is a town that's part of what's often called the new Latino diaspora. This is a town in a part of the country where traditionally there have not been Latino residents, but now all of a sudden, in the last few decades, really starting in 1994, 20 years ago, there's been a dramatic upsurge in the numbers of Latino residents settling in places like this. This is going on particularly in the Great Plains, with meatpacking especially, in the South with chicken processing and other sorts of agricultural work. But it's happening all over the country in the 40 or so states that traditionally have not been homes to Latinos, that were not historically part of Mexico. The new Latino diaspora is an interesting place because there are not the same sorts of entrenched models of Latino identity that you would find in Texas or California or places like that, more traditional Latino settlement. So in a town like this, a 15-year-old kid who comes from Mexico and arrives as the first place that he lands in the United States, he has a lot more flexibility in terms of how he defines himself, who he tries to present himself as, than if he had moved to Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, there are pretty clear visions of what it means to be a 15-year-old Mexican kid. In this town, those visions are not at all clear. That these folks watch TV and movies, so it's not that there aren't widely circulating stereotypes that they have access to. But people do not feel through their own habitual experience that they know what a Mexican kid is supposed to be like. That often in LA, you get the good Mexican and the bad Mexican are sort of the two choices that the kid has, relatively deep grooves that you end up falling into. Here, there's a lot more flexibility, and that fact of the new Latino diaspora makes this different. This town's a little different, similar to a lot of places in North Carolina and Iowa and so forth, but different than other parts of the country. Another particular thing about this town is that you heard the councilman there mention that there was a big wave of Italian immigration, first half of the 20th century and even up into the 60s. So there are a lot of folks in town, most of the business owners and landlords in town now are Italian Americans. There are still 70-year-old, 80-year-old, even 90-year-old Italian folks who were born in Italy, came as immigrants, still speak Italian preferentially. There's a Holy Savior Club is a place where a lot of the old Italian guys go to hang out. And I was very fortunate to have an Italian-speaking research assistant, and I sent her in there. I feel a little guilty about that, sending her. But she did an excellent job, and so we have some interesting interviews with some of the Italian speakers as well in the town. The Italian immigrants and the children of the Italian immigrants and the grandchildren of the Italian immigrants are, on average, more likely to be sympathetic to Mexican immigrants than other folks. It's because there's a similarity in the language. I've heard people speaking, one person will speak Italian and the other person will speak Spanish, and they claim to understand each other when they speak this way. My Spanish is not bad, I don't understand a word of Italian. But they claim that they can actually talk back and forth. And there's also similarities in the family-centered nature of the cultures, in the emphasis of the Catholicism. And so because of these similarities, you're more likely, I'm not saying that every Italian descent person in this town is happy to have Mexicans in town. That is absolutely not true. But I'm saying that on average, the fact that there was this large community of Italians and now Italian Americans means that as a Mexican, more of the so-called white people in town do not call an Italian person in this town white. I've called an Italian person in this town Anglo because of the typical distinction between Anglo and Latino, and for me the Mexicans are Latino, and I've gotten lectured more than once. Where was Latin spoken? What country was Latin spoken in? And so if they're Latino, I'm Latino, so don't make that mistake. So the Italian population here makes this town a little bit different, and it's a contingent fact. It's just a contingent fact. It was the same sort of point-to-point migration starting back in the teens or the 20s in the last century, from two towns, Montella in southern Italy and a particular town in Sicily. And those two towns sent a bunch of people there, and it was just contingent. It was quarries, it was rock. They were cutting rocks out of the ground. That was their job, and they were skilled at that. And so they were brought over. Other towns like this don't have lots of Italians. They have Polish descent people, they have Irish descent people, they have German descent people. The fact that there are Italians here makes a difference in terms of the opportunities available to the Mexican people. A third thing that's important to keep in mind is the very rapid historical change going on in places like this. So in this particular community, there's been very rapid change from a community that was dominated up into the 90s by bachelors. So the modal Mexican person in this town through the 90s was a bachelor. It was a single man living in an apartment with other people, a fragment of a family. Sometimes his sister was there or his cousin was there. Sometimes even a child was there. But the modal person was a single man living with other single men, working, sending money back, not tied particularly to this place, just working there. That's changed dramatically. In the last 10 years, the modal Mexican person is a young person, a member of an intact household, a young couple with several children. And that's the modal Mexican person. There are still bachelors hanging around, but the modal person has all of a sudden become these people who are much more tied to the place because they now have children who are entering school and who feel themselves that they have their network there. As Mexicans, they're extremely, extremely sad at having been pulled out of the extended family networks that are so central to how they think of themselves, emotionally and cognitively, but they've done it because of this immigration. And so the vast majority of them are in these intact single families. They don't see it, intact is my word. They don't feel it's intact because it doesn't include their parents and their cousins and their siblings, but from the perspective of an Anglo person, that it looks like an intact family because there's a mother, there's a father, there are children. Sometimes there's a brother who also has a family or a sister. So this change from bachelors to intact families with often mixed status families where the children have been born in the US but the parents have not, or the children have been born in the US, to citizens 10 years from now, all of a sudden that the modal person is going to be some 15 or 20-year-old person who is an American citizen who was born here. And so that shift has come very rapidly. And so a generalization about a town like this cannot hold for more than 5 or 10 years. I spend a lot of time in the schools. Right now, the schools have a bunch of Mexican origin kids in elementary school, and the high school still has mostly kids who came as 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 14-year-olds. In 10 years, that's going to be completely untrue. Virtually all the Mexican kids in 10 years are going to be fluent English speakers who grew up speaking English here and have been through the American public school system, and it will be dramatically different in terms of their prospects and trajectories. So what I'm saying is that you don't want to overgeneralize about towns like this because the towns like this are shifting so rapidly. There's also a question of the focal objects that you're trying to explain. So I'm interested in individual development. And when I look at particular individual kids, you have to take into account how that child's ontogenetic trajectory is influenced dramatically by what age the child came to the country. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but it makes a really big difference coming at age 5 and coming at age 15. It makes a difference in terms of access to the institutional system because of when you hit the school system, a big difference in terms of language skills, a big difference in terms of your sense of self and identity and who you identify with. And so when the child comes makes a difference, but that intersects with where the community is when the child comes. So coming at age 5, in 1992 or 1994, you would have been one of the only Mexican kids who was 5 years old in town at the time, one of a very small set. You would have been weird in school. That coming at age 5 now, or 10 years ago even, was not weird at all. That there were a bunch of other Mexican kids for you to speak Spanish with in kindergarten if you came at age 5, 10 years ago, and certainly today. So the ontogenetic trajectory of the child intersects with the historically emergent trajectory, rapidly changing of the town itself. And to make sense of something like, what are the prospects or the likely trajectories of this individual kid, you have to take into account those kinds of complexities. You also saw, just one more example of this, pardon me for beating the dead horse, that you saw that this is a town that has a large African-American community, and there are actually two pieces to it. The African-American community has a group of people who came with the Great Migrations at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Many of these people are established middle class, on the city council, business owners, elders in the churches. So there's a smaller group of African-Americans who've been around a long time and are central to the life of the community. And then there's a larger group of African-Americans who came out from Philadelphia starting in the 60s and the 70s. And that community has more of the challenges that you would associate with some of the communities in North and West Philadelphia. There's more crime, more drug use, and other things. Those two pieces of the African-American community have a somewhat uneasy relationship one with another. And those two communities have somewhat uneasy relationships with Mexicans as well. Not all towns where Mexicans or other immigrants are coming now to suburbs like this have a substantial African-American community like that, and that changes the dynamics. We're working on another film now about the first Mexican-American, or the first Mexican to run for city council in this town. And it was a very interesting dynamic because the other candidate was African-American, and the relationships between the two communities were sort of put on display in how it is that this man was received by the different voters he was trying to reach out to. So the first point I want to make is that we have to attend to the heterogeneous resources that contribute to any given focal phenomenon. It's very interesting to see large general patterns about places like this and how it is that they're developing at this historical moment. But in order to make sense of what's going on for people in these towns, we have to try to account for the different scales, the different resources, meaning the fact that this is a new Latino diaspora town, that there happen to be Italian immigrants there, that there's a particular moment in the town's trajectory, that individuals are moving along onto genetic trajectories at different points. And all of those things are relevant to making sense. The game analytically is to figure out which of those different factors are the relevant ones to making sense of the object I'm trying to explain, as opposed to just giving one picture of what's happening. So the second thing that I'd like to say that was sparked by reading the interesting papers and getting me thinking about how we can make better sense of towns like this has to do with the fact that revitalization is an interesting category, but it's not just an analytic category. So revitalization is an analytic category where we, as analysts, make sense of processes that are occurring in towns like this. That's absolutely true. Some of the generalizations we've heard about revitalization strike me as reasonable, applying to this town I'm working in and others like it. Revitalization is also a folk category. People themselves have beliefs about revitalization and how it's happening. And even worse, their accounts of revitalization causally influence what it is that's actually happening from an analyst's point of view. So we need a two-level account of what revitalization is doing in the world. For example, I've done a decent amount of work on the model minority myth. The model minority myth is a term that was coined to describe East Asian immigrants 50 years ago or so. And it turns out that Mexicans in many ways are treated as model minorities in this town. So there's an account of Mexicans as being particularly hardworking, refusing to take handouts, refusing to live off government subsidies, being family-centered, not complaining, not causing problems, not rocking the boat. Those are all important components of the model minority myth. And people in town will tell you, non-Mexican people and Mexican people too for that matter, will tell you that Mexicans are like that in this town. The one component of the model minority myth that does not apply, that people do not subscribe to or apply to Mexicans, is the notion of working hard and being very successful in school. So the stereotype about East Asians is that the kids work really hard and are very successful in school and will be professionally promising. That is not part of the stereotype of Mexicans that circulates more robustly in this particular town. So this notion of a model minority myth contains an element of revitalization in it. There's a theory that these people are coming and they're revitalizing our towns in certain ways. They're really hardworking, they're contributing a lot, they're family-centered. They're not going to get that far ahead in life because they're just really good at working hard at menial jobs, but they're really important to revitalizing our communities. So this is an account that you hear, and that account has a causal influence on the kinds of things that Mexicans are expected to do and asked to do. And in fact, those ideologies those beliefs about revitalization that are adopted by people in the context themselves, those ideologies are things that feed back on and influence the kinds of processes that we as analysts call revitalization. So we as analysts talk about, for instance, the opening of Mexican-owned businesses. There must be a dozen Mexican restaurants in this town. There are only 35,000 people there, but there must be a dozen Mexican restaurants and a half a dozen Mexican stores selling groceries and other sorts of things. That's revitalization from our perspective as analysts. How those stores and businesses are treated by, say, the local government in terms of regulations and permitting and things is causally influenced by their accounts of how Mexicans are contributing to revitalization. A Mexican person showing up for a permit is going to be treated differently than an African American person showing up for a permit, is going to be treated differently by an Irish American person showing up for a permit. And that's because people's accounts of how this kind of person is going to play a role in revitalization have a causal influence on how it is the processes of revitalization go. So the object that we have to make sense of is not just our own analytic account of what's going on, but how it is that their analytic accounts of what's going on are influencing how they behave and thus how the processes of revitalization go. So I think we need these sorts of two-layer analyses in order to make sense of what's happening. So those are my two additions or complications of what's going on. I really appreciate the opportunity to read the work.